Welcome back to the Chronicles of the King podcast, where we take a deep dive into the life and legacy of Elvis Presley. I'm Megan.
And I'm Tessa, and we are two 20-something Elvis fans dedicated to keeping his legacy alive with a research-based approach.
Whether you're a diehard Elvis fan or simply curious about a man who changed the course of music and culture, you're in the right place.
We are here to unpack the myths, explore the music, and get to the heart of Elvis's enduring impact.
Every other week, we'll bring you research, untold stories, and fresh perspectives on Elvis's journey. From his humble beginnings to his legendary performances, we're here to shed light on it all.
So settle in for a podcast made with a lot of TLC for the man himself, one story at a time.
All right, welcome back, guys. So this is our second episode into our new era. So we're not doing necessarily a series. We're picking things that we're passionate about. And today, this is one of Tessa's greatest passions.
My biggest.
We're going to be talking about the 68 comeback.
So the 68 comeback special, it aired December 3rd, 1968. It was called the Singer Special, but originally, because it was sponsored by Singer, originally wasn't called the Comeback Special. But it kind of, we figured we wanted to talk about it because it kind of comes off the heels of Elvis's movie stuff. So it's right at the end of his movie making period. And it's really something that brought him back into this new era that would then become the Vegas residencies. And really, in my opinion, the highest point of the Elvis story. We had there's that new documentary on Netflix that was called The Fall and Rise of the King. And I really liked that because it's almost, I feel that if the story ends after the 68 special, it's like a beautiful arc. But then we missed some of the 70s stuff, which musically I think was the best. Anyway, sidetracked.
No, but this is your favorite, so I'll let you sidetrack.
Thank you. So there's a very famous quotation by John Lando, which says, there's something, and this was his review of the 68 special, and he said, there is something magical about watching a man who has lost himself find his way back home. And to me, that kind of encapsulates the whole thing of the 68 special. I feel like, you look back now and you think, what are they some of it is a little scripted, a little dancey, a little goofy.
Very 60s.
Very 60s. I love it. Elvis just looks phenomenal, and he is just giving it up. And my favorite part is obviously the sit down sessions, because to me, that's just Elvis, that is in the big
supernatural, just how he's meant to be.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I guess the purpose of this episode is I'm not going to go to the behind the scenes of everything, what was going on, but more so we're talking about how it was a turning point in Elvis's career. What was happening before then, what was happening during the special, and then obviously what's going to happen after the special.
And so let's kind of just set the stage a little bit. So talking a bit about what Elvis's career was looking like before 1968. So as I kind of mentioned, he had this sort of movie era fatigue. And Elvis hadn't performed live in concert since March 25th, 1961, which was just shortly into when his career really became something. And then he had this 7-year hiatus where he's not doing anything, not doing any live performances anyway. So the last performance he had prior to the 68 special was March 25th, 1961, which was a benefit concert for the USS Arizona. And since Elvis had returned from the Army in 1960, he had been the leading man in, this said 27 films. I was trying to do the math at 1960 to 1968 for the 68 special. Whatever it was, he did about 27. I think it's 27. That
sounds about accurate, because
for the Army, or maybe it's 26 because there was the 4 before the Army.
Yeah. 4 before the Army, and there were there was a couple 1960, I think GI Blues is 1960.
Yeah, so GI Blues
Yeah,
until
and there was still he had those few films that he was finishing up after the
yeah.
68 like Change of Habit,
Yeah,
which we also know
so
how Tessa feels about that one.
that I do like that one. It's pretty funny. So this was something I thought was really interesting as
Mhm.
another point as to what Elvis's career kind of looked like. So when he had previously been at the forefront of innovation in music, he basically helped to condense all these different genres into a new genre when during
Yep.
the birth of rock and roll. He was sort of a spearheaded figure for that.
Mhm.
Um, at this point in 1968, Elvis had pretty declining musical relevance. So
Mhm.
I really wanted to touch on this because I think it's really interesting. But
Mhm.
groups like the Beatles, for example, were releasing like weird experimental music. They were now at the front of, they were just like teeny boppers. They were at the
Mhm.
front of developing music and musical styles. So, like Sgt. Pepper's, the album was released in
Mhm.
1967. And concurrently, Elvis was stuck in a routine of movie soundtracks and he wasn't really pushing the envelope in terms of the musical direction. Interestingly, though, Elvis did release other music during this time, and particularly noteworthy is the Grammy winning How Great Thou Art, which he won his first Grammy for in 1967,
Mhm.
which is really interesting to me given that 90% of the music he was putting out was movie soundtracks, so that he was
Yep.
recognized for his gospel recordings. And just kind of contextually, I wanted to put into mind the musical landscape of the time.
These do.
So, some of the top musical artists from 1968 were the Beatles, Otis Redding, in particular, with Sitting on the Dock of the Bay, which was
Mm.
recorded at Stax Studio in Memphis.
Love that song.
Simon and Garfunkel, so we have this kind of folk flavor. Sly and the Family
Mhm.
Stone, which is more of that soul vibes. We have the Doors, the Rolling Stones, so British Invasion. Aretha Franklin was a top artist.
Mhm.
Marvin Gaye, James Brown, more of that soul vibe. The Bee Gees and Creedence Clearwater Revival. Now, me personally, when I think of any of these groups, I don't really think of Elvis as doing in that time in 1968 as doing anything that was like on the same level as what
No,
these
he was.
artists were doing.
They were having him push out songs like Clam Bake.
Right.
Yeah. So definitely not on the same playing field, but this was definitely like his way to reclaim the spotlight. We have a quote from Billy Smith. He recalls that Elvis one time said, "I was scared to death when I'd done the special. I didn't know what the heck was going to take place. But the one thing that always always there was my music. I was just wanting to get back to that. He could have done it much earlier, but he had to be shoved into a corner and almost kicked before he would bite."
Yeah. I like that little quotation about the
Yeah.
music being
Hmm.
an enduring thing that Elvis like could cling on to
Hmm.
creatively and was something that he really wanted to prove himself with during the 68 special. Um, a little more of like the backdrop for setting the stage
Hmm.
for the 68 special. So this was something I found really interesting because I'm not sure if you'd heard this story, but the idea of Elvis having declining cultural relevance. And Steve Binder, who was the producer on the six director,
Director? Director.
producer director, I don't know. I think he did both. I think he was producer and director. I don't really know. He tells a story of taking Elvis out onto Sunset Boulevard and that he was trying to prove this idea that nobody recognized Elvis anymore or mobbed Elvis anymore. Sort of saying, like, we need to get your career in a different direction. And what I thought was interesting about this story, because I've heard this in a couple places in that Jerry Hopkins biography.
Hmm.
And then I think I've read it in the Steve Binder 68 special like coffee table book,
Yes.
and a couple other places, just that kind of highlighting this idea that Elvis was, not really as culturally relevant. But Lamar Fike, as per usual, disputes this.
Yep.
Um, the joke here is that in this Elvis and the Memphis Mafia book by Alana Nash, basically in a story someone tells Lamar is like, well, it didn't happen like that. And so
He's always there.
grain of salt, but I thought it was interesting. So Lamar said, Jerry Hopkins wrote that Steve took Elvis and Joe outside on Sunset Boulevard just to show Elvis he could go out in public and not be mobbed. The idea, I think, was to show him he wasn't such a big damn star anymore. Hopkins said Steve took him out in front of a topless bar at 4 p.m, and kids were knocking into him, man, and still not recognizing him. That's total bullshit. He took Elvis out on Sunset, all right, but phew, it was a mess. We had to fight to get him back in. And I kind of do believe Lamar in this circumstance. I think that
yeah,
Elvis
I mean,
he was like a movie star Elvis.
That's what I was gonna say.
Yeah. So he's still popular.
Lamar's always there, you know, to go to bat for us. All right, and then somewhere more my realm. So Tessa kind of give you like the more musical backdrop. I'll give you the more historical backdrop. This was something that they made very clear in the 2022 Elvis movie. I'm assuming most people have watched that. It was talking about the culture of 1968. And so during 1968, you have things like the Civil Rights Movement, you have Vietnam, counterculture to that. You also have the assassination of Martin Luther King and RFK Jr. No, sorry. Whoa. RFK Sr. And we have this quote from Jerry Schilling's book. I think it really helps summarize everything that was going on. He says 1968 was a year of extremes, a year of turmoil, and a year of enormous, often violent change. Police were beating student demonstrators on American streets, racial clashes were erupting into riots, and the war in Vietnam was starting to look unwinnable. The chaos of the headlines was reflected in the culture around him. Jimi Hendrix played and Tessa, you could help me with this,
Stratocaster.
Am I right? Whoa, we're good. Stratocaster louder and wilder than any guitarist before him, and the Beatles, who had achieved an artistic triumph with Sgt. Pepper, were now at work on their White Album. And with beards, mustaches, and shoulder-length hair, they bore almost no resemblance to the guys that had hung out at Elvis's Perugia Way house. Muhammad Ali had been stripped of his heavyweight title and brought up on federal charges for refusing his draft induction. Down on Sunset Boulevard, the hipsters in suits had been replaced by hippies in tie-dye. In Stanley Kubrick. Thank you. Kubrick. 2001: A Space Odyssey. The future looked to be even more confusing than the present. Old rules were being challenged. The new answers were being sought out. Thousands of people were turning to Eastern religions and philosophies, embracing some of the very same works that Elvis had read so fervently. And the Enlightenment through chemistry experiment we'd quietly attempted in the Graceland conference room, which that was the LSD trip, had been embraced by a much wider population. Psychedelia was turning up in music, in fashion, and even on Broadway. Hair. Yeah, and I think that's just that's a good way to summarize everything that was going on.
Yeah, I love how like Jerry put the music things and the different historical,
the cultural things that were.
Yeah, and just highlighting how this was not what Elvis was in touch with. He was singing to a damn dog, you know?
Exactly. Like... And I think when you look at it, it was almost, I think Elvis was changing with the culture, as not in the sense that he was going along with the culture, but they were having their change at the same time. And so I think the 68 also marked a time of him getting back in touch what was going on in the world, and not so much just like, all right, I'm going to show up to the studio, do my thing, go home and retreat to Memphis, and that's it.
Right. And so this next event that we kind of touched on was the MLK assassination, which occurred in Memphis on April 4th, 1968. And Jerry sort of tells us a bit about how Elvis reacted to the situation. He was still during filming of I think it's Live a Little, Love a Little, at that time. And so just if you want to read to us what Jerry said about the whole situation.
That because I did the last one so eloquently.
Absolutely.
Thank you. All right, so this is talking about when Elvis, and Jerry heard about the MLK assassination. He said, I was sitting with Elvis in his trailer, hanging out between scenes. He had a little TV in there that was usually on in the background, and the set grabbed our attention when a newscaster interrupted the program with a news bulletin from Memphis. Martin Luther King Jr. had been shot and killed. I was confused at first. He knew that the mayor of Memphis was refusing to meet with striking sanitation workers and that Dr. King had gone to the city to try to mediate the situation. But how could something so awful and wrong happen in the city we loved? The confusion quickly gave way to sadness. This had happened in our town and in a terrible way. It made sense. We were well aware that beneath all the good music for good people that had come out of Memphis, there had always been an ugly racial tension. It had been there in separate drinking fountains, in the separate counters at John Little's kitchen, and in the struggles of Sam Phillips. It had been there in Mrs. Doolittle's reaction to 60-Minute Man and in the early angry reactions to Elvis. Now the one hateful bullet, that sort of ugliness was being exposed for the whole world to see. Elvis didn't often speak openly about race or politics, but he had been greatly inspired by Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, and had committed much of it to memory. I heard him recite those beautiful, hopeful words many times. I looked over at Elvis now and saw that he was staring hard at the TV. There were tears in his eyes, and Elvis said he always spoke the truth.
Which I think is cool. Like that's the line that they use in the Elvis movie as Elvis's reaction to the assassination of MLK. And something, this is a side note, but something I find very interesting about the idea of Elvis being inspired by the I Have a Dream speech. So as we know in the 68th special, If I Can Dream was kind of the highest climactic point. We'll talk a little more about it later. But this was the song written specifically for the special and aimed to echo some of the injustices and call attention to some of the injustices that were happening at the time in the United States, in particular, clearly referencing the I Have a Dream speech, MLK's I Have a Dream speech. One thing I find interesting that I wrote a paper about is that Mahalia Jackson, who was a well-known gospel singer and someone Elvis greatly admired, is said to have been the person who inspired MLK to say the words, I have a dream. So he'd had apparently a written out speech that wasn't really resonating with the crowd. Like it wasn't getting the reaction that they wanted at that March on Washington. And Mahalia Jackson said, tell him about the dream. And I just thought that's like a cool little thread of, without Mahalia Jackson saying that, potentially there's this idea that MLK would not have said that I have a dream, which would not have become so poignant, so iconic. And then that would not have developed into If I Can Dream. So I just think that's a little interesting tangent.
That is. I like how all the dots connect.
It's about like the interconnectedness of specifically the 68 special with trying to be more on top of the unease in racial relations at the time and the kind of breaking point that it was reaching in 1968. That's it.
Well, thank you for that. And I definitely think If I Can Dream definitely reflected what was going on at the time. And even like we talked like in Jerry Schilling's quote saying that Elvis didn't really get involved in politics. He didn't really make comments on it. But I think this was for Elvis, it was a very respectful, universal way of just trying to throw a peace blanket, I guess you could say, on the situation.
I think it's also like him saying what he felt without saying it.
Exactly.
And like Dolly Parton, I think, does something similar where she doesn't speak on who she voted for, what she did, but she does show what she firmly believes in her donations, the fact that she thinks it's unethical to be a billionaire, like all those kinds of things that she like, anytime she becomes a billionaire, she donates money so that she's not a billionaire anymore. Which like, I love that. And I think that it's kind of like a nice way of I don't know, picturing Elvis doing that like in 1968, it's part of you is probably like, I wish he did that in 1954,
Mhm.
which I definitely think is fair, especially because the music that he so loved and integrated into his, new style of music was predominantly from the Black community.
Yeah.
I do think, better late than never. And it
Better,
came at a
but I
point
doing
where
it,
he
I
couldn't
think,
he couldn't not say something. At this point in
yes.
1968, if
Mhm.
he didn't say something, he was a real asshole. Like in 1954, unfortunately, he should have said something. And I think he did acknowledge that a lot of this music came from the Black community. He said it in
Yeah.
1954, 1955,
Mhm.
that Black people have been playing the music he's been playing, and no one's caused a ruckus about that until he started to bring it to the white masses in particular.
Yeah.
But at this point, it was like he had to say something, and his way of saying something was by singing the song that was written for the special that was clearly inspired by the I Have a Dream speech written by MLK, who died in his hometown of Memphis. It was like too close to not say something.
Exactly.
So,
Beautifully said.
Thanks.
So, all right. Well, I think okay, so covering those things, now we have our next segment of this little deep dive into the 68 comeback. So we're going to talk about the actual making of the special. Okay. All right. So first things first. So NBC and the Colonel originally thought that it was going to be a Christmas special. That was the original intention. Again, this is covered very well in the 2022 Elvis movie.
When have they got to sing Here Comes Santa Claus?
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Okay.
Let it pass.
No, she just said if it's a Colonel Parker quote, she's gonna say it. It's in that weird Tom Hanks Colonel Parker accent.
Yeah. Ah, Snowdog. So stupid.
Thank you. Okay. Snow, Christmas, that's related. It's okay. Okay, so in 1967, the Colonel negotiated with NBC to put together a TV Christmas special and a movie, so Change of Habit. And obviously Change of Habit, came out. We have the special, but it was not a Christmas special. Originally intended, it was, like I said, traditional holiday situation. He was going to sing Here Comes Santa Claus. There was going to be sweaters, snow, Christmassy. It was coming out in December. But obviously the producers, we have Rob Finkel and director Steve Bender, they made a change. They made a change, and I think the change was for the best. And then we have, hence, the 68 comeback.
Mm-hmm. And so Steve Bender at first, which I think was interesting, I read this in Peter Goralnik's second volume of his Elvis biographies, Careless Love. So he says that Steve Bender was originally a little hesitant and reluctant to be on the project because he was like, I don't want to, like, who's Elvis now? Like, what's
Yeah.
And an unsung hero of this whole production, someone that I don't think we ever like say his name or associate him with the 68 special. Like if I'm thinking people from the 68 special, I think of like Bob Finkel, Steve Bender, and like this kid. Like
exactly,
those are the people I'm thinking of. But an unsung hero was Bones Howe, who was the music producer for the special, and he is the one who actually. So he and Steve Bender worked together pretty closely, and he is the one who convinced Steve Bender to do the project and work with him on it. And then some other key figures that I just wanted to highlight that were involved in shaping the 68 special. So we have Bones Howe, Billy Goldenberg, another super important figure in this, who was the music director and arranger. So he did the arrangement for If I Can Dream. Then we have Bob Finkel, our producer, Bill Ballou, who designed all the costumes in line with Binder, and Gene McAvoy's vision for the special. So Gene McAvoy was the artistic director for the special. Then we had Tom Diskett. And then here was just a little behind the scenes anecdote that I loved. And something that surprised me for a multitude of reasons. But this is about Elvis playing the Moonlight Sonata on the piano. So this is from the Peter Goralnik book again. So Billy Goldenberg, the musical director, recalled, quote, the first time that I walked into the studio, Elvis was sitting at the piano playing Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. So I think, what's going on here? This is really interesting. And he says to me, oh, do you know this? I said, yes, I know that. He said, what happens after this? And played the first part again. So I sat down next to him and played some more of it. He said, that's great, and picked it up. And we spent the better part of our first rehearsal period learning the first movement of the Moonlight Sonata. I was so surprised. We would go on night after night, and every night we would do a little bit of the Moonlight Sonata. One night, Elvis was playing it on the piano, and the door opened, and in walked 2 or 3 of his guys. Immediately, he picked his hands up from the keyboard as if some strange dark shadow came over the place. They came in and said, what the fuck is that? He said, oh, it's just something we were doing. And they said, oh, it's awful. And he didn't make any remarks, just picked up his guitar and started playing those old E major chords again. That's what they wanted to hear. And that was the end of our rehearsal period for the day. But the next day, Elvis couldn't wait to continue. So I thought that was like an interesting, I don't
But then
know,
it also
private.
makes me sad because they were like, what is that?
And it was
always-
Beethoven, like,
I know.
and he's trying to learn it. And I think it's just interesting because you so don't associate Elvis with playing like classical piano by any means ever. It's kind of highlighting my, I think he could read music standpoint.
Because that's just not something I feel like sure, you can do Great Balls of Fire maybe by ear, but like the Moonlight Sonata, I just don't feel like that's
right.
Like,
anyway, so I just thought that was interesting into this like private versus public Elvis, the person he was for other people, that he also felt so comfortable with this Billy Goldenberg that he felt like he could musically actually do something that challenged him creatively. Because Elvis singing the Moonlight Sonata is not something that I think would have come naturally or easily to him.
No.
And so it would have, I think it would have been creatively fulfilling for him to do that. So I just thought it was an interesting anecdote because also you picture like the raw and the grittiness and like the sexiness of the 68 special, and you're not thinking like some beautiful classical piece of piano. And that's interesting too, that's how he was, the mindset he was in when doing this very raw and powerful performance. It's kind of like, again, the public and the private and blurring the lines of the two. And I'm even really interesting.
I'm even thinking like coming off of the movies, and we talked about like everything was not creatively challenging. It was just like go in, record, and so at the same time he's still doing things like the Moonlight Sonata. And so the creativity, the talent is there, but it just was never being challenged.
And I think it's so interesting that like, and I think it almost to me proves how creatively in tune he was with the 68 special, because the musical director was able to sit with him and do this, and he felt comfortable enough to do that and be pushed in that way. And so it's like they were on the same page, which I think very few other times was Elvis on the same page with the people who were around him, so.
But I love that little musical tangent there.
I know, it's so cute.
Now we get on to something else, something maybe I can talk a little bit more about. The leather suits.
There's I'll talk about the leather suit.
There's much to say. Well, I'll do the quote while you just sit over there and just drool, think about it. Okay? All right. So obviously Bill Blue, he is our man. He designed that suit, and dude should have won like a Nobel Prize for it, I think.
Goodbye.
Okay. But no, okay, so we have this quote from Priscilla's book, Elvis and Me. So she says, each day he grew more confident and excited about his new project, taking pride once again in his appearance. We saw that. Watching his weight, following his diet, and working closely with the show's costume designer, Bill Ballou, creating a look we hadn't seen him sport in years. The black leather suit. I was surprised when he said, Sidon, I feel a little silly in that outfit. You think it's okay? Elvis knew this special was a big step in his career. He could not fail. For 2 straight months, he worked harder than all of his movies combined. It was the most important event in his life.
I think that Perfect.
Chef's kiss. No, that
yeah.
leather suit. I think the leather suit also, I think we can talk about costuming. For performance for the special, I feel like it really solidified like the tone, the feel. I don't know if you feel the same way about that.
Yeah, well, so I was reading that, like I said, that coffee table book and just kind of skimming through it. And there was something of how someone, it might have been Bill Ballou, someone had seen a picture of Elvis riding a motorcycle with a leather jacket. It could have been Bender, actually. And Bender said, I want to like recreate that. And then Bill Ballou was like, well, what if we just do an all leather suit? And the thing was, like, they weren't really thinking of how hot and sweaty it was going to be up under those lights.
Yeah, not
like
much
they were
practical.
not. No, and so apparently Elvis was like a bitchin' and moaning, but he realized he looked really good, so he couldn't really complain that hard. He's like fine. There's also an anecdote about what happened during the sit down special moment. Okay, so I will say this because it's an interesting anecdote. In this book, it's in the second book. Yeah,
I can remember.
So he says that Elvis was so like excited by his performance that there was a situation below the belt, shall we say.
Thank you for making PG.
I'm trying to think of a way to say it that's not going to make me like so embarrassed.
Go read the book.
Okay, so go read the book. It's the coffee table book from they sold it at Target. There was a excitement situation below the belt, let's say, which we could go into a whole thing about that psychologically speaking. We're not going to, but you can ruminate on it if you would like.
Yeah.
Moving on. So do you want to tell us about Elvis's nerves about the performance?
Yeah, because that's just a great way to transition from this. All right. So Elvis's nerves, obviously, the man hadn't performed since 1961. So long time since he's been back on the stage. Anybody's nerves are going to be just a little shook up, if you can say. I know.
That was good.
Thank you. So from Peter Grolnick's book, Careless Love, he said, when asked by Bender and how he felt about doing a special that stemmed from his life, his music, Elvis replied that he was scared to death.
Yeah.
So
I think it's interesting because Lamar Fike, as per in the Elvis and the Memphis Mafia book, was like, he wasn't nervous. What are you talking about? So,
which
it's just interesting.
That I feel like I have to be like, no, that's not the case.
Right. You can see his hand shaking. Like, he had to be nervous. And he always had stage fright. And this was, as Priscilla said, the most important event in his life. Priscilla also talks a little bit about Elvis being nervous. And I feel like at this time, she would have had a great insight into that. So she says in Elvis and Me, it had been years since Elvis had appeared on TV and he was nervous. To his surprise, Steve was much younger than he had anticipated, extremely perceptive and soft-spoken, a startling contrast to the studio heads he'd worked with, men much older with hardened, preconceived opinions on how Elvis should be packaged and sold. For the first time in years, he felt creative. Steve Bender gained Elvis's trust and had the sensitivity to let Elvis just be Elvis. Steve observed, took mental notes, learned Elvis's ways, discovered what made his star comfortable and what got him uptight. During their meeting, Steve sensed Elvis's fear that he hadn't been before a live audience in years, but he noticed that Elvis came alive backstage in the dressing room, jamming with the musicians. So this kind of leads us on to actually talking about the performance in the 68th special and what I would suggest is the most iconic and best section is the sit down set with the original bandmates.
Yes. Sorry. So this one, mostly the rest of the special was scripted. We have the different segments, choreography, all the shebang. The sit down, the kind of like rehearsal, if you will, in the round was completely unscripted, kind of just more of a jam session. And so this is from Grolnick's book. He's actually said, one night, Steve Bender wandered into what had now become a familiar scene and suddenly experienced a revelation. This was the way to go. This could be their way to make a statement with a totally unscripted improv substituting for the stiff, somewhat arch informal segment specified in the script. So wandered in, I'm assuming he means that he was wandering into the dressing room, which if you read Scotty Moore's book, they talk a lot about that when they all got together. They would just be in the dressing room, like jamming out. Any song that came to mind, they would all join in, just have a little fun.
Mm-hmm. And so originally Bitter had wanted to actually film the segment in the dressing room, but eventually they decided to fly in some of Elvis's original musicians. Like we have DJ Fontana and Scotty Moore to play alongside him. And during this section, there were some topics that they wanted Elvis to cover that they kind of gave him, talking points on.
Yeah.
But for the most part, like I said, it was improv. And a lot of that resulted in this raw, stripped down sound. And I think really gave people a good idea of, it's like Elvis Unplugged. It's almost like a tiny desk concert before they had a tiny desk concert. Like he is just without really that much. There's no glamour.
Yeah, there's no restraint either on what he was to do or wasn't allowed to do.
Definitely. It's very different, I think, from the other sort of more iconic visuals from the 68 special when we have, in particular, the gospel medley. And in Steve Binder's book, he said something about how he hadn't wanted Elvis to lip sync because he felt that it was going in that particular shot or in that particular scene. He wanted Elvis to just be singing live, but Elvis was nervous that he wouldn't be able to sort of keep up with like all of the glitz and the glamour and like the choreography going on behind him if he was singing live. So they chose to put a track over it, like a pre-recorded of him singing it, which I think is interesting. But If I Can Dream, which was like the big finale, was not pre-recorded. I mean, they did pre-record it because they were like, oh, if he messes up or the mic is too far, like we could just kind of splice it. But that was like 90% like the raw take from that shot. So I thought that was pretty interesting and emotionally gives it a little bit weightier. And then we got some big quotations coming in about If I Can Dream. Lots to talk about it.
You want me to read it?
Do you want me to? You're giving me the look like you want me to.
Yeah, you can read because then there's more.
Okay. So in Geronic's Careless Love, he writes about the If I Can Dream finale, that it was that very intensity, Elvis's whole emotional involvement in the act of recording, that brought home to Steve all over again how much they needed an ending. To get this kind of passionate commitment out of him and then to end with I'll be home for Christmas would not only be a mistake, it would be in the nature of an aesthetic crime. It would betray the democratic vision that Steve had come to feel was the essence of the show. All of a sudden, I realized I've got Elvis Presley, Colonel Parker, Confederate flags, a black choreographer, a Puerto Rican choreographer, and a Jewish director. Everything in the show was integrated. Behind the scenes and in front of the camera, Elvis singing along with the Blossoms, the black female gospel-drenched backup group that Elvis had insisted upon. The dance section's black and white and, purple. I mean, there was a spirit on the show where you hated to go to sleep because you were so anxious to go back to work the next day. We were all one big family. That was what galled Steve most about the lack of any real conclusion. It was what goaded him to keep casting about for a different way to say those things that he knew Elvis felt but could never fully express, whether because he was not permitted to or because he was temperamentally disinclined. The finale should be a kind of summing up, Steve felt, a declaration of shared idealism. To that end, he approached Earl Brown, the vocal arranger, about writing a song. I took Earl aside and I said, Earl, let me explain something to you. We're under the gun now, and what I need, instead of having him do a monologue at the end, let's do a song where we incorporate what his monologue would say. That was all I contributed. This is what I would like the song to be. So Earl went home, and at 7 o'clock the next morning, he woke me up and said, Steve, I think I've got it. I really think I've nailed the song. So I went into the studio and Earl played the song for me. It was called If I Can Dream. And I said, that's it. You've just written the song that's going to close the show. So now I go to Bob Finkel and I say, Bob, I've got the end of the show. And he said, do you realize what you're doing? The Colonel will blow his stack. It's got to be a Christmas song. I said, it can't be a Christmas song. This is the song Elvis will sing at the end of the show. I arranged for Elvis, Billy, Bones, and myself to go in the dressing room, and Earl sat down at the piano and played it through. Elvis sort of sat there listening. He didn't comment. He just said, play it again. So Earl sat there and played it again and again. Then Elvis started to ask some questions about it, and I would venture to say Earl probably played the song 6 or 7 times in a row. Then Elvis looked at me and said, we're doing it. I think that's really interesting too, that it wasn't written like for the show at the beginning, but that they didn't have a finale and a closing section that wasn't like a Christmas song.
It was more spontaneous.
Yeah, I really like that.
Right. So you read that one. The next quote talking about the creation of the song. I will read this one, and I would love to hear your take after I'm done. All right. So this is from Peter Gronach as well. He says Billy Goldenberg wrote the arrangement overnight, and Elvis recorded it in 5 takes on Sunday, June 23rd, the last day of formal recording. Although he is singing to a full orchestra backing, it is the voice that predominates as much as it would if he were singing unaccompanied. As the colonel would undoubtedly have preferred, the song is a well-intentioned liberal statement about peace and brotherhood and universal understanding, but is not the lyrics that command our attention over the gulf of years. It is rather the pain and conviction and raw emotion of Elvis's voice as he sings to a world where all my brothers walk hand in hand, and almost screams out the last line, please let my dream come true right now. There is no way of neatly summing up the meaning of the moment. It is one of those rare instances where Elvis pays no attention to format boundaries, as his voice, deliberately roughened throughout the song, teeters perilously on the same dubious note as the conclusion of each finished take. Under other circumstances, the song might seem to no more than a trite, generalized plea of understanding, set to a somewhat awkwardly hyperdramatic melody, but somehow, whether because of Elvis's conviction or the listener's knowledge of its cost, the words take on worlds of meaning. The melody soars. There is a thrill along with the wince at the final note in every listening. As Steve Bender recalled, Elvis asked that the lights be dimmed for the final take, both in the studio and the control room. I think he was obvious to everything else in the universe. When I looked out the window, he was in an almost fetal position, withering on the cement floor, singing that song. And when he got done, he came in the control room and we played it maybe 15 times. He just loved it so much.
Yeah, I really like the description of Elvis's voice in that song as paying no attention to formal boundaries, and that his voice was deliberately roughened and teetering on a dubious note. And I think that is what makes that such a powerful song. The lyrical content is, I don't want to say pretty obvious as to what it's alluding to, but it is pretty clearly alluding to racial integration and a more accepting world wherein we can all, sort of get along, brotherhood, all that kind of stuff. And something that we talked to Dwight about was how difficult he said that it was to emulate the sound that Elvis was vocally creating in the time of, if we think about like 68, 69 to 70, yeah. That he had this raspiness, this grittiness, this sort of reckless abandon of technique, not completely like, he's still Elvis, like he can't sound bad, but he
wasn't necessarily polished sounding. That makes sense.
It's not the same smoothness and operatic quality that we hear locally in like It's Now or Never.
I was gonna say the same thing.
Yeah, like that is things. That was much smoother, and he's really concentrating there on trying to emulate an operatic sound, whereas here he is singing rock and roll, baby, straight from the heart. Like there is no, and even when he's singing a song that I wouldn't call If I Can Dream a rock and roll song, it's more of just like a ballad. He still has that rock and roll grittiness, that rock and roll authenticity, I want to say, in his voice that sort of makes you feel like, yeah, he has seen this and has experienced this, and by recalling this idea of rock and roll in a song that isn't really a rock and roll song. He's kind of bringing the whole origin of rock and roll as being a black and white genre that melded together, kind of a melting pot of a genre. He's kind of bringing that same idea into the song If I Could Dream, with the contrast of this big ballad being sung in such a gritty, authentic, real way. That's my take.
Beautiful. I loved it. All right. And I know that was like a lot to unpack. We're winding down a little bit right now. We just came off the high point of the 68 comeback.
Yes.
Everybody, it's 1968, December. Everybody has just, seen it sitting in their living room.
Okay. And so just to talk a little about the critical and public reaction, I also wanted us to touch on some of the reaction of people who were around him and closer to him at the time. And so Marty Lacker said in the Elvis and the Memphis Mafia book, quote, "The night NBC broadcast the singer special, I saw it on TV before Elvis did because of the time difference. At first, I wasn't totally blown away until he did that impromptu set in a leather suit, the part where he paced back and forth like a panther. That was just raw animal magnetism. I remember saying to myself, that's what Elvis is really about. As soon as the show was over, I called the house out in Los Angeles. Joe answered, and Elvis grabbed the phone because he wanted to hear somebody's opinion. I said, man, let me tell you something. If nothing else, you did one thing. He said, what's that? I said, you finally showed him the real Elvis Presley instead of the guy in those movies. And he said, man, I'm glad you said that. I love that.
I think that's really accurate. Like, that's the Elvis Presley that everybody knew. That's the Elvis, you could say, from the early 50s, like 56. This is peak Elvis. He's back. He's in his prime. And this was like the perfect segue into what is then the Vegas years, starting in 1969. It led to Vegas. It led to things like That's the Way It Is, Elvis on Tour, Aloha from Hawaii. And this is from Lamar as well. I mean, yeah, back with Lamar. He said, sometime after the singer special, we flew into Vegas on Hughes Air West. And the Colonel picked us up and took us to the Aladdin Hotel. Elvis wanted to see the show and stuff, and the Colonel wanted to gamble. We were riding in the car, and the Colonel said, you could do the show that you did for the singer special here in Vegas. I looked at Elvis, and he looked at me. When we got out of the car, he said, looks like I'm getting ready to do Vegas, and thought that was fine. He told the Colonel, yeah, let's do it. And when we finished Vegas, we'll go on tour. So that's how it all started. For pretty much the rest of his life, he'd do his show in Vegas, then go out on the road. That was the next step right after recording sessions he had lined up for the first part of the year.
Yeah, so those recording sessions, we have Elvis going to American Sound. And I think probably my favorite Elvis album, Elvis in Memphis, is right off the heels of the 68 special and sort of right before he went to Vegas. And it's just a really interesting time period. You get like Power of My Love, which is like, whoa, raunchy, and Suspicious Minds. Like, you get all of this like amazing music after. It's kind of like, I feel like he deserved it after all those years of doing movie soundtracks. He deserved like that album. It's a
pent up energy.
Like, it's banger. Like,
I forgot how good that album was, actually.
No, like every song on the album is good. Like, it is so good. I'm just gonna read you the lineup. So this album from Elvis and Memphis, this album would not have happened without the 68 special. Like, it just would not have been a thing.
100%.
So we have Wearing That Love Don't Look, banger.
Good.
Only the Strong Survive. Good. I'll Hold You in My Heart Till I Can Hold You in My Arms. Long Black Limousine. It Keeps Right On Her. I'm Moving On. The Power of My Love. Just On My Mind. After Loving You. True Love Travels on a Gravel Road. Any Day Now. In the Ghetto. Suspicious Minds. Don't Cry Daddy. Kentucky Rain. And Mama Like the Roses. I guess not It's Only Lemon, but I thought it was
like bangers. Only
hit after Singing Dog's Life. So
yeah,
valid,
very valid.
And just kind of going back to some of the reactions of the people around Elvis, this was Jerry Schilling's reaction to the 68 special. He says, tanned, thin, dangerous, and singing straight from the soul. Elvis was back with a vengeance. I was sitting in a small conference room at NBC watching a rough cut of Elvis's TV special. It was just Elvis, myself, Joe, and Charlie, along with producer director Steve Binder and a network executive. I don't know what I'd expected this show to be, but from the first moment to the last, it was obvious that Binder had allowed it to become the kind of artistic challenge Elvis had been so hungry for. For the first time in a long time, somebody had let Elvis be Elvis, rather than the tame, nice guy next door he'd had to play in so many films, and he rose to the occasion in a spectacular way. The special's loose storyline was guided along by Jerry Reed's Guitar Man, and the set pieces combined gospel music, modern dance, karate moves, and always Elvis in peak voice. There was an informal jam that teamed Elvis with Scotty Moore, DJ Fontana, Charlie Hodge, and Lance Legault, as well as Alan Fortas, who contributed what he could by tapping on the back of a guitar case. There was also a solo performance during which Elvis wrote through some of his old favorites. In both sequences, Elvis was in black leather pants and jacket, and at 33, looking better than ever. The show didn't have a studio feel and a network feel or a Colonel feel. The whole thing had a true Elvis feel to it. And yes, there was a little Billy Murphy in his walk. The special ended with a song written for the occasion, a plea for peace and brotherhood called If I Can Dream. The shock and hurt of the loss of Dr. King and then Robert Kennedy was still heavy in the air, and Elvis gave himself over completely to the stirring music and the simple message of hope. It was a breathtaking performance, and the pain, the power, and the heart that went into it made one thing very clear to me in that little conference room. The guy who had created all that excitement back in the 50s could still, in the turmoil of 1968, move you to tears with his awesome, undimmed talent. Nobody had originally talked about this as a comeback special, but Elvis had turned it into one. I really like that.
Yeah, that last part, it's like, it was never, I know they always talk about, it's like Elvis thinking like, we know this is not really comeback, like, but always being here, but it was a comeback in the sense that you were going to remind everybody, like, I'm still the king of rock and roll. This is what I do, and I'm great at it.
And just that idea that, like what Jerry says, that the guy who created all that excitement in the 50s could still create an excitement in amongst and be culturally relevant in a way that he hadn't been for a little while.
Because that's over 10 years. It's over a decade later.
Yeah, he was still the king of rock and roll, which I just, I love. And then you have this New York Times review, which I
So we're getting a little bit of an outside perspective, and we know from the movie reviews that we were doing, the New York Times can be very critical. So seeing this review from him, I thought was perfect. So this is from the New York Times. It is from Robert Shelton, December 4th, 1968. So right after the 68 special came out. He said, but there's more about the show to praise than to lampoon. As the progenitor of rock and roll revolution that has swept the world, Mr. Presley made history translating the free and total involvement of self and rhythm into an erotic and Dionysian experience. He helped bring the pop world from illusion to reality. He was the catalyst for making youth pop into a medium alive with sexuality and urgency. And I thought that was a really good outside perspective on it, because I think, like I said, if they're saying he was culturally irrelevant, he was just kind of sitting there on the back burner, I guess you could say, doing the movies, fading into the background. But then after this came out, people like Robert Shelton were like, no. Like, he was the catalyst for everything. He was the reason that the people like the Beatles, I know Elvis mentions the Beards as well in the 68 comeback.
Which I love, because he's saying the Birds, the band, the Birds, but he's saying it, the Beards. And I love that.
But I always say it.
I'm a big fan of the new groups, the Beatles, the Beards, and whoever.
I'm like gonna say
care less.
We have to say it the way Elvis said it, okay?
Okay.
We're gonna do that. So but yeah, he was the catalyst for everything. And so I think it was just a good reminder that without Elvis, I think a lot of the musical talent that came after wouldn't have existed, or at least wouldn't be the style that we knew it.
And what I think is just like kind of wrapping things up, like sharing our first impression of the special. So for me, my impression was that my mom had said to me that like no man will ever look sexier than Elvis in the 68 special. And we had like a 1968 special, like a Liz Barbie kind of in our house. And we had that my whole life. Like I didn't know nor care. Um, and then I watched the Elvis movie and I was like, oh, I care. Oh, I care. And
I care
right after,
very much.
I think it was like the first thing I watched after the Elvis movie
Okay.
was the 68 special because I just like loved that part of the story. And,
It's a
the
big
leather
part of it.
suit I can't be mad about it. And, that was kind of my very first impression. But my first impression of the special is, oh my gosh, like some of this is so corny. But when it's not corny, like when it's not, it's so good. And like you can look at it and kind of in that way that I like change of habit of like this is all like theatrics and like in a way that I appreciate it for what it is. I'm not like shitting on it by any means, but it's not to my taste, I guess I'll say. Some of the karate scene and the whole like the bordello scene of the
60s.
it's yeah,
One
it's like
the explained.
yeah, it's like a Broadway musical, it's like glitz, glamour, showbiz. But the thing that stood out to me is his voice. We got some bangers on that 16 soundtrack. Saved. I used to smoke, drink, and dance to Hoochie like straight hit. You can see his nervousness. It's like palpable.
Yep.
The sit down sessions, just basically anytime he's wearing the leather suit and singing, that really stuck with me for the obvious reason and for the less obvious reason of just how much that was like Elvis. Like if I have to show someone like a quintessential Elvis video, I'll show them a sit down. Probably trying to get to you, I'll show them that sit down. Or one of those sit down sessions from the 60s special. Like that's just what you have to do. What was your first impression? I'm curious. Like, when was the first time you even heard it? And all
I feel like the first time I watched it, it probably was 15. But even me, the 15-year-old, I'm just like, whoa. I know. But no, I was definitely because the first thing I remember seeing is like that opening, him in the leather, if you're looking for trouble. And so it was definitely like the sit down moments, him in the black leather. Those are always the ones that are going to stick out to me because it's very much quintessential 68 comeback. And I'm just like, okay, this is what Elvis is. Because I know when you just think a typical person, not us weirdos who just, obsess over everything Elvis, most people are going to think like the caricature of Elvis, in Vegas on stage with all the bling and the jumpsuits. And so seeing him in the black leather, very raw, doing like the original stuff, but with the new spin on things, I was just like, okay, no, this guy actually has talent. He's not some weird caricature that just, harps on things that he did in the 50s. I don't know if that makes sense. I feel like that's a good outside perspective of what a lot of people think. So getting to see that, I was like, okay, this is Elvis. But then I'm also on board with you. Some of the things like, I will say the choreography at the beginning of the gospel section, I'm just like,
I get it. Like, I understand what they're doing.
It was the 60s, and I feel like there are just a lot of things going on that
I think I mentioned before too of the whole like thing in the whorehouse scene where there's a black woman who is being sort of viewed as like as equally desirable as the white women.
Yeah.
I think that that's pretty interesting. I think it's interesting the integration of the set and all of those. I can kind of appreciate those. The outfits he wears, like that black velvet kind of thing, the white, if I can dream suit, the red, like there's so many really cool visuals from it. And the karate thing is like so over the top. Like it's
I always wondered though if Elvis was like, look, we can do this, but we have to incorporate the karate.
I bet. I feel like to me it's like the special as a whole kind of encapsulates both this idea of Elvis as this caricature kind of in a way. You know, it sort of shows this showmanship.
Yeah.
It has something for the people who are expecting that of him. When you're expecting like a jumpsuit, and he's not wearing jumpsuits, but he is wearing a high necks, you know. So there's like the sort of start of that fashion idea coming, and you know, the all white, and then the very particular like the neck start, all this kind of stuff. Like
I love the
there
neck
are
scarf. So
moments of him wearing, you know, kind of over the top outfits that people might expect, and the jewelry, like even his watch, and he has his wedding ring is like huge, you know, all that kind of stuff. But there's also the very real
yep.
Elvis in the special too, of his nervous and his hand shaking when he reaches up for the microphone and is about to give his one of his best performances of his life. And that to me is kind of what I like so much about the special, is that there is that vulnerability while also being like, yeah, and glitz, glamour, Elvis in red, you know, like, and also it's like Elvis in the glit, you know, the red lights, and also just like Elvis in his handwriting. Does that make any sense? Like that it's like,
yes, it's Elvis that everybody sees.
Elvis.
I get it. Yes.
You know,
it's like the Elvis that the world sees, and then there's the Elvis that's like behind the closed doors.
And I think both of those Elvises, Elvi, are in the special.
Yes.
So. Now, this is a really interesting idea that Megan had, which I love, is on our Instagram. She asked for people's comments, questions, or stories about the 60th special. And I don't know if you just want to read through some of the comments that we got, because that was really fun.
I was just really curious to see everybody's like opinions and hot takes on the 68 comeback. So we have a couple here. The first one is that he was the healthiest, happiest he looked. Prob the tan and genuine smile helped. He seemed really happy. And then we got, I remember, and this one we have to give context to. I remember seeing it after he passed. The bordello scene was there.
Right. So I just read about this in that little coffee table book, which was really like good. It's mostly pictures. Like there's really not that many words. I mean, the pictures are nice because it's 1968 special. So who can be mad about it? But the context of this is that originally when it was broadcast, they only had a 60-minute broadcast, and that did not include like the whorehouse scenes, the bordello scenes. And so after Elvis passed, they were obviously like recycling all the footage they could. And one of the things that they did was they then released that extra 30 minutes. And that is what everybody has come to know now as the 68 special, although that wasn't what was first broadcast that night. So it's interesting. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah. And then we have, so another one says, Elvis had his spark back from the movies to bad press to feeling lost. He was back. Next one, pure Elvis gold. So many great new renditions of his older songs and so handsome. And then this one we have from Dwight. So we were really fun to see this one. The sit down jam session is my favorite part of the special. Elvis is his raw best, which
love it.
We definitely agree with that.
I mean, we agree for sure.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we just thought it was interesting. We're going to keep doing this. I'd love to do like a whole series about all of Elvis's like TV specials. So we'll probably
like concert documentaries, TV specials.
Yeah, kind of the makings of them and all that stuff. I think that would be really interesting to do. But we just have to talk about the comeback. Today I told my mom we were talking about it. She said, our favorite. I was like,
our favorite. And this is like, I thought it was a good time to talk about it because June 27th was when they were doing the filming. June 27th, 1968. So coming off the heels of that.
Definitely. And, you know, what's not to love about it? Go watch it in our honor today.
Yes. All right. And so we'll give you, I guess, the next episode 2 Fridays from now.
That's all we have for today. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Chronicles of the King podcast.
If you love what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. Your feedback helps bring the King's story to life.
You can follow us on social media at the Chronicles of the King for updates, upcoming series, and more. We'd love to hear your input and any of your favorite Elvis moments.
Until next time, keep rocking and rolling, and we'll be back soon with more stories from Elvis's extraordinary life.
With TLC, we'll see you on the next episode of the Chronicles of the King.